welcome to Good Grief, the podcast dedicated to demystifying and destigmatizing grief. I'm Nikki. I'm an end-of-life doula and a grief coach in Columbus, Ohio. Thank you so much for tuning into my show. Today, we are going to get personal. We're going to be discussing sibling grief, and I will be sharing my own personal experiences with sibling grief. To preface that, I lost my brother in 2015 when he was 40 years old. He's 3 years older than I am. So I was 37 at the time. We were obviously adults. And I'm not going to go into the specifics, but my brother did have a lifelong battle with heart disease and congestive heart failure. So we will come back to that in a little bit. But first, I just want to talk briefly about sibling grief in general. Adult siblings are sometimes called the, quote, forgotten mourners because their grief oftentimes is overshadowed by grief of other family members, like their spouses, their children, their parents, things like that. Not to say that, people don't have sympathy for siblings of loss. Obviously, that happens. I received a lot of sympathy and, a lot of outreach from my friends. I was absolutely blown away by just how many of my personal friends who never even met my brother came to the funeral to support me. So, I'm kind of excluding myself from this, but a lot of times more emphasis is put on the parents of the person who was passed, or the children, and again, no one person's grief is more or less meaningful than another person's grief. So it's not saying, I'm not trying to say like, oh, well, why didn't anybody pay attention to me? It's obviously myself excluded from this. I was very well supported and very well loved and had all the support I could possibly get when my brother passed away. But a lot of times other mourners are focused much more on, like I said, the spouses, the children, the parents, and maybe not as much the siblings. And again, like I said, myself excluded from this. And a lot of people out there are like, well, sorry, I can't pay attention to everybody and everything all the time. And that's that's fine. That's understandable. I'm just giving you, the research that I have found. There is a national group called the Compassionate Friends, who focus more on loss of children for parents who've lost a child, no matter the age. It doesn't have to be, a toddler child, an adult child. Parents who've lost their child. And I went to a few there. They have meetings in most major cities, and I went to a couple of those with my mom after my brother passed, and they welcome siblings as well. They welcome anybody. They're not going to turn away somebody who's grieving. And they kind of showed me, there's a Facebook group anyway. I don't know if they do like meetings in person, but there's a Facebook group called The Sounds of Siblings. It is specifically for people who have lost a sibling. And I have found some great support there and a lot of beautiful humans who are, suffering just as much as anybody else. So if you're looking for support, I would recommend Sounds of Siblings Facebook group. You do have to, it's a private group and you have to answer a lot of questions just to make sure they don't get, ne'er-do-wells in their group causing problems. But I recommend that. So anyway, back to sibling grief. So I mentioned before, siblings are considered, quote unquote, the forgotten mourners. And as I will say ad nauseum, no grief is lesser or greater than another grief. Everyone's grief is grief. But the dynamics of the loss of a sibling is very different than the dynamics of losing a parent or a friend or a spouse. Again, I'll say it a million times, grief is grief. Grief is grief. Your grief is valid. Your feelings are normal. But there's some complication to grief, and there's a lot of different weird feelings that'll come with it. And this is where I'll get a little personal, talk about some of the things that I went through. that I since read later are things that seems like almost every sibling goes through. And again, everybody grieves differently. There's a lot of feelings of guilt. I know, and again, it very often depends on the relationship you had with the deceased. You know, if you had a close relationship or not a close relationship. My brother and I had a very strained relationship. We were never really super close at all. And, you know, when we were little kids, we hated each other. We fought. We were very, very different people, and we fought a lot. And, you know, once we both got to be adults, we were able to get along again just fine. We didn't have any kind of bad relationship. There was no bad blood or anything like that. We didn't have anything in common. So we were just never super close. You know, he wasn't the kind of brother, we weren't the kind of siblings that called each other all the time to just talk on the phone and, you know, hug and hold hands and things like that. We loved each other, obviously, but we weren't best friends because we had absolutely nothing in common. But that's not to say I didn't love my brother. Obviously, I love my brother very much, and I know he loved me as well. But there were some feelings of guilt when he had passed that I felt I should have loved him more. I should have reached out to him more. Maybe I should have talked on the phone with him every other day or once a week or something. And why didn't I do those things? And then guilt of, you know, I'll be open too about my struggles with mental illness. And, you know, I've absolutely been suicidal in the past. And like, why did my brother have to be the one of the two of us to pass away? Like, obviously neither one of us should die, but there was absolutely feelings of guilt of, you know, why did he have to die and not me? Which sounds unreasonable to an outside listener, but made sense to me, you know? So guilt was a huge part of it. And then feeling of anxiety, I guess. Feelings of a kind of anxiety because my parents only had the two of us. We were the only two kids. So he's gone now and it's just me. And like, not like I can't deal with my parents. Obviously I can deal with my parents, but you know, my parents are going to get older and I will be the only one to manage things, you know, as they get older and as they eventually pass. I've told them they're not allowed to die, but let's face it, we're all going to die someday. So there's a lot of feeling of anxiety. Now I'm alone in this. I'm going to be alone in dealing with the loss of my parents, and I won't have my brother to, you know, I'm going to start crying, you guys. I won't have my brother to be there with me. Obviously, I'll have support. You know, I have my husband and I have plenty of friends, but it's different. They're my parents, and the only other person that could say that they are parents is my brother, and he's not here anymore. So there's a lot of feeling of anxiety with that. And a feeling of, what's the word I'm looking for? Responsibility. That, again, not just taking care of my parents, but they lost their only other child. I'm the only surviving child for them. And it's a huge responsibility for me. Now, I take very good care of myself, and I maintain incredibly good health, but like the fear of something awful happening to me, like I can't control if, you know, a car skips a curb and, you know, hits me walking on the sidewalk, or somebody runs a red light and, you know, something happens to me out of my control. You know, obviously there's nothing I can do about that, but just the anxiety and responsibility of having to stay alive for my parents is real. And that sounds weird. Like, oh, I have to stay alive. Like, obviously I want to stay alive. But just that responsibility of nothing can happen to me because my parents, the idea of my parents going through that again, I can't fathom that. I really can't. I've said before, I can't fathom the loss of a child because I've never had children. But thinking of them going through that a second time, like that's not a grief you don't get over. I'll say that a million times. You don't get over your grief, but just knowing the impact that the loss they suffered has had on them. I don't, my mom has said before she couldn't survive if something happened to me. So that's a big plate of responsibility on my table right there. Obviously, when I don't mind, I love my parents very much and I would do anything for them. So one more emotion or reaction that might come out of any loss, really. But one, since we're being personal here, one I've experienced a lot was anger. I feel like anger is normal for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. But I'm thinking of this specifically right now because a couple weeks ago, my brother's daughter got married. And I remember when he passed away, one of the first thoughts I had was who's going to walk her down the aisle because he's not here. It turned out beautifully. Her mom walked her down the aisle to this gut-wrenching song. But there was a moment after the ceremony when her mom, my sister-in-law, said, "Wait until we're done with photos, but you need to look at her bouquet, my niece's bouquet." And I was like, oh, okay. So when things calmed down, I asked her to see her bouquet, and she had a little photo of her dad, my brother, with a little heart that says, said something to the effect of, "I'll be with you always." And my entire side of the family just lost it. And that anger I felt when he passed away, it was still a little bit there, but it was just such joy that in his own way, he was still there and he was still able to walk her down the aisle. And that was all her. That was totally her idea. Nobody told her to do that. Nobody gave her that suggestion. My beautiful niece did that all on her own. And we were all just incredibly, listen to me, I'm crying. We were all incredibly touched by that. It was a beautiful moment. Okay, anyway. So grief can get really complicated when you lose a sibling. There's a lot going on there. It's not that any grief is simple and straightforward. All grief is complicated. So some coping mechanisms for grief that we'll get into at other times, but always just remember that whatever you're feeling is normal, no matter how stupid it seems. I went through some absolutely bizarre feelings. I've said this before, but every now and then people will feel feelings of relief when somebody passes away, especially if it's somebody who's been suffering a long battle with any illness. It's a relief that they're not dealing with that anymore. And even someone might tell you it's selfish, but the fact that you don't have to deal with it anymore. I didn't have to worry about, I absolutely, I'll be open. I had feelings of relief of, I'm not going to have to worry about, will I get a phone call one day that, my brother's heart finally gave out or he had a massive stroke from all the medications he had to take for his heart complications. Like, I was always kind of waiting for that phone call and knowing that that phone call did come and now I won't ever have to worry about that phone call again. There's a sense of relief with that. And I felt so guilty for so long about that feeling of relief. And I remember discussing it with my mother. And, once I started realizing that feeling of relief is normal, I was able to give myself a little bit of slack with that. And like I said, a lot of people will feel that feeling of relief and they'll feel guilty about it. And don't ever feel guilty about any of your feelings associated with grief. Don't, because there's no need. I'll say it so many times you're going to get sick of hearing it. Everything you're feeling is normal and every feeling you have is valid. Your feelings are valid. Your feelings of grief are valid. Okay, enough of that. So that's, really about all I had as far as sibling grief. I could talk about coping mechanisms, but that's like a whole other episode we'll do sometime. But with any loss, there's ways you can honor the person that you lost. And I don't always like using that term lost. It's like, he's not lost. I know where he is. He's gone. He's dead. I try to use gentle terms because that's what people like. But also we need to destigmatize using the word dead and death. So many people are afraid of saying the word dead. Somebody is dead. Anyway, that's a rant I'll get on in another day at another time. But there are ways you can, honor the person that's gone. Honor the person that you loved who is now deceased. I try to honor my brother as much as I can, through just maintaining my relationship with my parents, which I love them dearly. Love you, Mom and Dad, if you're listening. I would do anything for them because I know they would do anything for me. And I'm not trying to make up for his amount of love by giving them double. You can't do that. And his love will be different than mine is. That's just how it is. But I honor his memory by loving my parents, remembering him, and doing as best I can, for his two children, my niece and my nephew, and loving them deeply and unconditionally. Also, my brother was a Boy Scout, and he really enjoyed, that was a huge part of his life. He really enjoyed, being part of the Scouts. And he and my dad hiked Philmont multiple times. I think my brother went twice. I honestly can't remember off the top of my head. I want to say he went twice. And I know my dad's been out there a few times as well. I actually have a tattoo on my foot of a mountain called the Tooth of Time, which is at Philmont, if you're familiar, on my foot, in honor of my brother. So I also am a very avid nature lover and hiker, which my brother was as well. He didn't hike as much, towards the end of his life, mostly because of his health, but he was also busy. He had to work a lot, so I don't think he got out as much as he used to, but I know he really enjoyed those trips and he really enjoyed hiking, and that's become a huge passion of mine. So I feel like when I go out on these hikes, I'm honoring his memory in that way a little bit too. So that's the story of me and my brother. I know a lot of friends, unfortunately, who've also lost their siblings, mostly through cancer, but I've known a couple people who lost their siblings due to addiction, overdose, and those are hard. There is no better death or worse death. Death is death, and loss is hard, and grief is hard. That's it. That's my story of me and my brother. Okay, so now the portion of the podcast where I read a card from the Death Deck. I feel like I should have some kind of cool sound effect with that. Anyway, so I'm going to read from the Death Deck. I am shuffling through the cards, and today's question is Deadly Thoughts. Would you say you imagine your death or the death of your loved ones more often? I'm sorry if I put the T in often, if that offends you. Deal with it. I would say just due to the line of my work, yes, I think about my own death and the death of my loved ones quite a lot, actually. I feel like if I didn't, that would be a red flag, given what I do for a living. So, hey, if you do, it's okay. If you think about your death or the death of your loved ones often, that's okay. Now, if it's interfering with your daily life and you can't function normally, then that might not be okay. It might be time to talk to somebody about it. But yeah, I think that's totally healthy. And don't forget to check me out on Patreon. That'd be super cool if you did. I'm not expecting this to be a paycheck, but all the money that goes to my Patreon just goes to me providing pro bono work to people who cannot afford to pay for it. Okay? Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this and got a little something out of it. Even if nothing, you got to learn a little something about me today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please feel free to leave a review. Do whatever you do with the podcasty things. Tell your friends and family if you are so inclined. Thank you. And remember, all your feelings are valid. Grief is okay. And whatever you're thinking or feeling, somebody else has thought it and felt it too. You're not alone. Thank you. Good Grief was brought to you by me. You can find me online at nikkithedeathdoula.com. Today's episode was produced by me. Research and scripts written by me. Your host is me. Editing and sound design also me. Music is not me. Music is Cheery Monday by Kevin MacLeod. License information can be found at filmmusic.io/standard-license. Special thank you to my best friend and husband for constantly reassuring me that I don't suck.